Let me now turn to what these and other economic developments imply for the public finances relative to our October forecast. Before accounting for the effects of policy, a shortfall in tax receipts, especially in corporation and self-assessed taxes, shown in the yellow bars, adds £6 billion to borrowing this year, but only £2 billion by 2029-30, as higher nominal earnings growth boosts income tax and NICS receipts. Higher gilt yields and inflation push up debt interest costs across the forecast, and by £10 billion in the final year, as shown by the blue bars. And, as shown by the grey bars, forecast changes increase other spending by £4 billion next year, mainly reflecting higher capital spending by local authorities and public corporations, but only add £1 billion to borrowing in the fifth year. Taken together, and before accounting for policy decisions, these changes to our underlying fiscal forecast add around £13 billion to borrowing in 2029-30, as shown by the white diamonds. Against this weaker pre-measures fiscal outlook, the government's announced a series of policies since our October forecast. In December, we had the final details of the government's reforms to the residential planning system. While these don't have any direct tax or spending implications, we do expect them to deliver a significant increase in the rate of house building, which has a positive knock-on effect for our estimates of GDP and government revenues from housing and other taxes. Specifically, we estimate that the government's planning reforms will deliver an additional 170,000 houses and take net additions to the UK housing stock to around 1.3 million over the next 5 years. We expect this to provide a temporary boost to demand via increased residential investment and a permanent boost to the level of potential output of around 0.2% by 2029. This is a result of a boost to the productivity of residential construction and the increased flow of housing services, which continue to rise beyond the forecast horizon. The Spring Statement also includes changes in the level and composition of departmental spending, which leaves it slightly higher by 2029-30. Within this, capital spending is increased across the forecast and by £4 billion in 2029-30. This mainly reflects the government's announcement in February that it would increase defence spending from 2.3 to 2.5% of GDP in 2027-28. The capital-heavy increase in defence spending is funded by more current-heavy cuts in overseas aid from 0.5 to 0.3% of GNI. Other changes increase current spending for new policy commitments, including a new transformation fund in the near term and a medium-term increase to funding for DWP employment support programs announced last week. But in the final year of the forecast, these are offset by an unspecified reduction in the overall current spending envelope, which leaves it £4 billion lower in 2029-30. Finally, in last week's Green Paper, the government announced a package of welfare reforms, which are estimated to reduce spending by £5 billion in 2029-30. These savings arise mainly from tightening the gateway for personal independence payments, which reduces PIP awards for around 800,000 claimants. Further savings from reducing the generosity of health-related universal credit for 3 million families, with savings focused on new claimants after April 2026, whose health element is halved. And these reductions are partially offset by an increase in the standard allowance for all 7 million families on universal credit, and the decision to reverse the 2023 reforms that tightened the work capability assessment. Looking at how these policy measures compare against the deterioration in the underlying fiscal outlook since October, the policy package outlined on the previous slide results in a net reduction in spending of £4 billion in the final year of the forecast, shown in dark green, to which the Chancellor adds a number of tax increases, shown in light green, which reduce borrowing by a further £2 billion by the end of the forecast. And these policy changes, together with their indirect effects on the economy, leave borrowing around £4 billion higher in 2029-30 than we forecast back in October, as shown by the black diamonds. But because some of the spending changes, notably the defence increases and overseas aid cuts, swap lower current spending for higher capital spending, they return the current balance, the Chancellor's fiscal target, to exactly where it was in the final year of our October forecast, as shown by the white circles on this chart. Looking at what both forecast and policy changes do to the overall path of government borrowing, the net effect of these policies was to offset most of the deterioration in the underlying fiscal position since October. Borrowing is now forecast to fall from 4.8% of GDP this year to 2.1% of GDP by 2029-30. But it's still around £8 billion higher on average over the next 5 years than we forecast in the autumn. Debt is broadly flat at around 96% of GDP over the forecast, but it's around £30 billion higher by the end of the decade than we forecast back in October due to the additional borrowing over the next few years. Looking at what all this means for the specific aggregates targeted by the Chancellor in the fiscal rules she set back in the autumn, as you can see from the lines and blocks on this chart, underlying forecast changes tip the current balance rule from a £10 billion surplus to a £4 billion deficit in the target year of 2029-30. But the policy measures included in this spring statement and their indirect effects on the economy were enough to regain all of that lost headroom and restore the current budget back to surplus of £10 billion by the end of the decade. Turning to the Chancellor's target to get net financial liabilities falling as a share of GDP, this objective was on track to be met by £5 billion even before taking account of new policy measures. And the measures included in the spring statements return that headroom to £15 billion, also broadly the same as the Chancellor had back in October. £10 billion of headroom against the Chancellor's main fiscal rule may sound like a lot of money. But as you can see from this chart, it's a third of the average margin of £30 billion set aside by all chancellors against their respective fiscal rules since 2010. It's the third smallest such margin any chancellors had against their rules over that period. And it's the same margin this chancellor had left in her October budget, which was eliminated by an increase in interest rates and other relatively small forecast changes over the course of just the last few months. This illustrates that the headroom that the chancellor's maintained against her fiscal rules is a tiny fraction of the risks of the outlook over the next 5 years. This spring statement does make some progress in addressing 3 key risks we've highlighted in previous fiscal risk reports. First, it funds an increase in defence spending from 2.3 to 2.5% of GDP by the middle of the Parliament, although it also creates a new, more expensive and as yet unfunded commitment to increase spending further to 3% of GDP in the next Parliament. Second, the Pathways to Work Green Paper begins to address the rising cost of health-related benefits. But there are significant uncertainties around the costings of the welfare measures included in this forecast, and many of the broader policy ambitions in the Green Paper are yet to be clearly specified. Third, this spring statement breaks a historical pattern of asymmetric policy responses to forecast changes, in which windfalls are generally spent, but shortfalls are not fully made up. In this statement, on our central forecast, all of the £14 billion deterioration in the current budget was recovered by the final year. And the Chancellor's headroom was restored to the £10 billion she had in the autumn. But the array of potential claims on that small amount of headroom are large and varied, and I'd like to close by exploring 3 of those. Uncertainty around the UK's recent productivity performance, continued volatility in interest rates across advanced economies, and escalating global trade restrictions. One of the single greatest risks to the fiscal outlook arises out of the difficulty in interpreting what the most recent combination of population, employment, and GDP data implies for the future productivity of the UK economy. Our central forecast assumes that the fall in recorded output per hour worked that the UK has seemingly experienced over the last 2 years represents a mix of permanent structural weakness, temporary cyclical factors, and measurement challenges. And underlying productivity growth picks up from the 0.3% this year to 1.25% by the end of the decade, around halfway between its pre- and post-financial crisis averages. But this still leaves a level of productivity at the forecast horizon over 1% lower than in October. In this EFO, we also consider a downside scenario in which this very poor recent underlying productivity growth persists into the future and remains at just 0.3% per year over the remainder of the forecast. In this scenario, the current budget would end the decade in deficit by around 1.4% of GDP, and the Chancellor would miss her fiscal target by £48 billion. We also consider the implications of an upside scenario, in which all of the current observed weakness in productivity is cyclical, and output per hour returns to the same level we forecast back in October by the end of the decade. In this scenario, the current budget would be in surplus by around 1% of GDP, and the Chancellor would overachieve her fiscal rules by around £33 billion. A second key source of risk to the fiscal outlook is continued volatility in global interest rates. Since early October, daily 10-year gilt yields have varied by a full percentage point, between 3.9% and 4.9%. And as shown in the yellow on these 2 charts, it would take only a 0.6 percentage point increase in market expectations for gilt yields and bank rate to tip the current balance from a £10 billion surplus back into deficit in 2029-30, the target year for the Chancellor's fiscal rules. And with UK gilt yields being highly sensitive to developments in global bond markets and continued uncertainty about the direction of fiscal policy in both the US and the Eurozone, even more extreme scenarios for interest rates will be plausible. A final source of risk to our forecast is the outlook for global trade policy. Our central forecast for the global economy is based on the IMF's January World Economic Outlook, which did not include any effects from the higher tariffs introduced by the new Trump administration in the US, or the retaliatory tariffs imposed by other countries. However, we do explore the implications of an escalating trade war between the US and its trading partners for the UK economic and fiscal prospects. The object of these trade scenarios is not to estimate the precise impact of what continues to be a rapidly changing trade policy landscape. Rather, is to illustrate the potential orders of magnitude associated with different levels of escalation in global trade policy restrictions. In a first scenario, shown in yellow, we look at the implications of the US imposing a 20 percentage point increase in tariffs on all goods imported from Mexico, Canada, and China, with all three of these countries retaliating in kind. In this scenario, the lasting effects on the UK's output and public finances are limited, though we do face some near-term reduction in GDP as a result of higher uncertainty and reduced demand for our exports from other countries directly affected by the tariffs. In a second scenario, shown in green, we look at the implications of the US extending its 20 percentage point increase in tariffs to all goods imports, including those from the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world. This would take the effective US tariff rate to around 25%. But in this scenario, we assume that the rest of the world does not retaliate. In this case, the UK experiences a larger and more lasting loss of output, peaking at just over 0.5% in 2026-27. And the corresponding loss of tax revenue and increase in inflation-linked spending virtually eliminates the headroom against the Chancellor's current balance target by 2029-30. The third and final scenario, shown in purple, illustrates the consequences of the UK and the rest of the world retaliating by levying their own 20 percentage point increase in tariffs on all goods imported from the US. In this scenario, the UK experiences a larger loss of output, which peaks at around 1% in 2026-27. And while the Exchequer gains around £9 billion a year in additional tariff revenue, this is more than offset by the loss in revenue from other taxes on domestic income, consumption, and profits. And the net result is that the Chancellor's fiscal headroom is almost wiped out by the fifth year of the forecast. In summary, since the Chancellor presented her budget in the autumn, the economic outlook has become both more challenging, with output stagnating, bond yields rising, business and consumer confidence falling, and energy prices rising over the past 6 months, and less certain, with big questions around the UK's recent productivity performance, European security arrangements, and global trade policies. Against this more difficult backdrop, and before taking account of spring statement policies, the forecast we presented to the Chancellor halved the rate of GDP growth this year from 2 to 1%, and left the level of productivity lower in the medium term, and showed the current budget in deficit by around £4 billion at the end of the decade. In the run-up to this spring statement, the government announced reforms to the residential planning system, cuts to welfare and departmental spending, and an array of smaller tax measures. These and other changes were just enough to restore the headroom against the Chancellor's main fiscal rule to a £10 billion surplus, the same as she had back in the autumn. But this is still the third lowest margin any Chancellor's had against their fiscal rules, and the risk to the outlook for UK productivity, interest rates, and global tariff policies could all reduce it back to zero over the next 5 years. And with that, I'll hand it back to Laura, who will chair the discussion of your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. As usual, we will reward those who've come here in person and ask some questions in the room first. Jessie's got a microphone, so she'll come to you. And if you could say who you are, if you're willing to, before you ask your question. So, Jessie, let's start here. This woman here. And then I will come to Slido after that. So if you're joining us online, do ask questions on Slido, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. But let's start here.
Hi, Mehreen Khan from The Times. A question about some of your growth assumptions. You assume that despite the sort of weakness we've had recently, the economy will rebound quite strongly up until the end of the forecast period. Can you explain why? And there is some fiscal tightening, which is penciled in from around after 27. Does that have a growth impact? It doesn't seem to show in the forecast. On productivity, secondly, is it time now, given the weak outturn, that your productivity, your long-run trend productivity estimates will have to come down? Is this a process you're going to start thinking about, sort of interrogating this, given how important it is? And maybe just stepping back, I mean, is the OBR becoming quite uncomfortable with the fact that, you know, decisions that you're making, some small changes that you're making to some of your estimates are having a huge impact on political choices the government is having to make almost on a 6-month rolling basis? Does this suggest that actually this is not the sort of power that you should be wielding and something's actually wrong with the fiscal framework in this country?
That was an excellent, at least 3 questions. I will ask David to pick up the first 2, and then you can ponder on the third while he's doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that growth in our central forecasts, obviously these are central forecasts, huge amounts of uncertainty around them, more uncertainty, I would say, now than probably any forecast that the OBR has done, certainly since I've been there. It's true, there is a bit of a pickup. It's partly because the weak growth of last year and this year, we think is beginning to create a bit of slack in the economy, and the labour market clearly has weakened rather a lot. And that means that it's more than likely that the Bank of England does what the market's expected to do. They cut interest rates further, a fair amount further, and we get slightly stronger growth after this year, which is another very weak year of growth, and it's partly on the back of using up some of that spare capacity. I should say, though, that the absolute number for growth is about 1.8% or so after this year, where it's only 1%. I mean, if you go back a little while now, it used to be considered the sort of cruising speed for the UK economy was 2.5%. I mean, that's what it did for most of the period from the Second World War up till about, well, up to the financial crisis. So if you get back to 1.8% growth, some people think of that as optimistic. I mean, in the bigger picture of the UK economy, that is a relatively weak rate of growth. I mean, we think it's about the cruising speed for the UK, which has slowed down relative to history because productivity growth is a bit lower. But that's the story of the forecast in a sense. Some of the things that are holding back growth this year, a bit of a pickup in inflation, interest rates have gone up relative to where we thought in October. I mean, those things begin to unwind somewhat a little way down the road.
And thinking about our kind of medium-term productivity assumption?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of halfway between what I call the dismal last decade or so and the 50 years before that. So before you get to the financial crisis, and since the end of the Second World War up until 2008, 2009, productivity in the UK grew by about 2% a year. So people thought that was normal. And then we had the financial crisis, and then much later, of course, COVID and Russian invasion of Ukraine and huge increase in energy prices. Over that more recent period, it's been like 0.5%. So the question is, of course, what do you think the next 5-10 years look like? Does it look like most of the post-Second World War period for the UK, in which case a 1% assumption, a bit more than 1%, which is our central forecast, is uber pessimistic? Or do you think that the next 5-10 years looks like the dismal last 10 or 15 years, in which case our central forecast looks pretty optimistic? So it's partly a question of, well, what period in history do you think will be most like the next 5 to 10 years? And I think the honest answer to that is that economists have got no better insight into that than political scientists or historians or most people. And so what we do is we pretty much split the difference between the miserable last 10 years and the 40 years before that, roughly speaking. That gets you to a little bit north of 1% for productivity.
Thanks, David. And Richard, are you uncomfortable about changes to the estimates given the tight numbers inherent in bits of our forecast?
I guess on the broader question about the powers the OBR has, the powers that we have are the same ones we've had for the last 15 years, which are the ones given to us by Parliament, which are to produce a central forecast, to assess the costing of government policies, and to assess whether the government's on track to meet the fiscal rules that it sets for itself. Chancellors set their own fiscal rules. If they want to break them, they can. If they want to change them, they can. The task they give to us is to assess whether they're still on track to meet them once we take account of their policies. The Chancellors set their own policies as well. So all of those levers are very much in the hands of the Chancellor of the day. And one of the reasons why policy has ended up being very responsive to changes in our forecasts is because recently, as you saw in the graphs, Chancellors leave themselves tiny amounts of headroom these days against their fiscal forecasts. And so what you saw in this forecast, I think, has been emblematic of what you've seen in recent forecasts, which is very small changes in a fiscal forecast over a 5-year period. We're forecasting £1.5 trillion worth of revenue, £1.5 trillion worth of spending. What you saw here was a swing in the difference between the two of 14 billion. That is tiny by comparison to the totals that we are forecasting. Unfortunately, Chancellors have left themselves tiny margins for manoeuvre against their fiscal rules, which means if they want to stick to them, they have to adjust policy in light of what are relatively small forecast changes, given that we're looking 5 years ahead in the space of lots and lots of uncertainty. So I think the sensitivity of policy to our forecast is not driven by our forecast, it's driven by the fact that Chancellors tend to not achieve their fiscal rules by very much of a margin.
Thank you. Question at the front.
Thank you. Iron also from the Telegraph. I was hoping to ask how much of the growth downgrade comes from Rachel Reeves' own tax policy and potentially sort of talking down growth, and how much of it is, I guess, global factors or what she could blame on external factors. And could I also ask, as you mentioned, the headroom looks very small compared to sort of previous years. What are the chances that she'll have to come back in autumn and raise taxes?
Excellent. So that was just 2 questions, so we're making progress. David on the first, and possibly Tom or Richard on the second.
On the question, you know, how much of it is that some of the tax rises announced in the October budget that are going to come into effect very shortly, mainly, of course, the increase in employers' NICs. I don't think we've changed our estimate of what effect that has. And in the October economic and fiscal outlook, we gave an assessment there, which was negative. It does something to employment. It knocks a bit off productive potential in the economy. Don't think we've seen anything in the period since then that changes that. So that's not the main factor behind you know, a pretty big downgrade for growth this year. And that's really on the back of interest rates have gone higher, not just in the UK. It's happened in Germany, throughout most of Europe, in fact, to some extent in the US as well. The surveys, consumer confidence, business confidence, have clearly turned down a bit. And then you've got the actual estimates of GDP that have come out, which for the second half of last year were pretty weak. January number, it's only a month, basically flat, slightly falling, in fact, GDP. So it's those factors. And we haven't had any new taxes in this budget for us to put through. I mean, there are some sort of positives on the supply capacity of the economy to do with house building in this forecast. Of course, that doesn't do anything right now. In 2025, the lags are quite long. That's all at the end of the forecast period.
Sorry, if you don't mind, do you not think the sort of weaker sentiment coming through in the surveys might be sort of because of the autumn tax rises?
Could be. I mean, it's always difficult to know. I think businesses kind of realised pretty quickly after October that what it meant. Maybe some of the sort of very recent sentiment is partly a reflection of a growing realisation that we could be in for a major blow to trade. That wasn't there clearly in October, November. People know who the next president will be, but you never quite know what they might do. And now it seems a bit clearer that there's a real risk of tariffs.
And we'll quickly do the second half of the question, which was, what are the chances of the headroom being retained through to the autumn, and will the Chancellor have to make changes to tax? Do you want to take that, Tom?
Yeah, thanks. So, well, as Richard said in his presentation, the £9.9 billion worth of headroom is very small compared to the risks around the forecast. We assess the probability of meeting the target with that amount of headroom is basically around 50%. It's a central forecast, so we think there are risks in both directions, broadly balanced. But the risk analysis that Richard showed, that it would not take much to eliminate that headroom again. So a 0.6% increase in gilt and interest rates, a 0.1% lower productivity, the worst case tariff scenario that Richard showed could eliminate the headroom. But as I say, yeah, it's a central forecast, so we think the risks are broadly in both directions.
Great. This gentleman here.
Thank you, David Robinson, Market News. You've done something the Bank of England hasn't done, which you've got quite clear scenarios around the tariffs, which you just mentioned. Typically, people thought tariffs would be stagflationary. What you seem to have come up with is something where you get the hit to growth under different scenarios, but you don't get persistent inflationary effects. Can you just explain why you don't, and how confident you are you in that assumption that there won't be persistent inflationary effects from tariffs?
You take that, David.
Yeah. It's partly because there's well, for a start, if there's a tariff war between various countries, but the UK stays out of it, maybe people put tariffs on us, but we don't reciprocate, then there isn't an increase in prices of stuff coming into the UK because we're not the ones who are applying tariffs. So it isn't much of a mystery that in those circumstances you don't get a big inflation effect on the UK. Now, one of the scenarios is it's all out war, everybody retaliates, whatever's done to them, they do back to whoever did it. And that is a bit more inflationary, but it's also more depressive of economic activity and GDP, and that is something of an offset. Furthermore, if you remember what a tariff does, it leads to a sort of step change in the price of imports if you're the one applying a tariff on stuff coming into your country. It's a kind of step change in the price of things that people buy. Unless there are second round knock-on effects, then it doesn't cause ongoing inflation. So it becomes a question really about whether the short run impact, which is almost immediate because suddenly the prices of things you import goes up quite a lot, or the prices of things you import from those countries that are applying tariffs to you, and that may only be one country, that will only generate ongoing inflation if, for example, in wage negotiations, Labour tries to claw back the effects of the first round effect of the tariff having gone up. And then you get into a question of, well, if a tariff war like that makes the economy weaker and unemployment a little bit higher, and there's more slack in the economy, those second round effects will be quite weak anyway. So it's a kind of long-winded answer. But in a nutshell, that's why it isn't the main effects on inflation, probably.
Thanks, David. Any more new questions in the room? One just in front of you, Jesse.
Paul Wallace. I'd like to just ask you about welfare reform and whether really it was wise to introduce changes in the welfare system against this particular objective of making savings to apply for 2029. I mean, we know that welfare reform consistently has effects which weren't anticipated by policymakers, so that seems to increase the doubt about making them in such a rush.
Tom?
Thanks. Well, so we're very clear in the analysis that we have done that there is a huge amount of uncertainty around the estimated savings from the welfare reform package. Partly that is because, as we've set out in the report, a number of the analysis of the changes that were made was given to us relatively late in the process and without the usual level of analysis and evidence that we would usually require to do these kind of costings. But there's also just a huge amount of uncertainty around the underlying forecast of welfare spending. So welfare spending in particular on working age, disability and health-related benefits has increased very rapidly over the past few years, from around 30 billion around the time of the pandemic to around 50 billion now. And we're forecasting, even after the impact of these measures, that it will rise by a further £15 billion over the forecast. But the drivers of that increase that we've seen in the recent past is quite uncertain. It's quite likely to be driven by a number of different factors. So there is evidence that the health of the working age population has declined, partly because the working age population is aging due to demographics, but also there's evidence that in particular there's a rise in mental health conditions amongst younger people in the working age population. So health is likely a driver. It's also likely the case that there are economic factors driving that increase. So in particular, huge cost of living pressures that we've seen over the past few years, likely to increase financial incentive for people to claim health-related benefits which have a higher reward than non-health related benefits. And then also it's quite likely that there's just been quite a lot of change in the structure and operation of the benefit system over that period, which is also likely to have driven some of this change. So that means that the forecast is obviously uncertain, and the evolution of the economy and these kind of health trends, as well as policy, are likely to have a big impact on the actual evolution of spending over the next few years.
Thanks, Tom. We're going to take some questions from Slido because there's lots on there. I'll come back to the room for a second round in a bit, so you're allowed to go again if you've thought of another one. But some questions online, probably going to come to you first on a couple about the Employment Rights Bill and make work pay, David. Sue Chan asks, you've understandably not costed the impact of the Employment Rights Bill, but you say that regulations that affect flexibility will likely have material and probably negative economic impacts on employment prices and productivity. Please elaborate. And Mauricio Alensar at CTM similarly asks, the ABR did not make an analysis of the government's plan to make work pay. When will the ABR make this assessment of policies in the bill? So a couple of similar questions there for you, David.
Yeah, well, we haven't come up with any estimate of what the impact of making work pay measures is going to be, because it's still a little bit up in the air. There'll be legislation going through quite soon, but then there may be secondary legislation, and some of it will be changed with amendments. So a bit difficult to know where it might end up. So that's why we didn't do anything this time round. In terms of what might happen, well, I think that will depend very much on what actually ends up being the law. Things which reduce the flexibility of employment contracts from the point of view of the employer, in many cases might have a mild impact, but when they do have an impact, I mean, it's probably negative to some extent. So altering, for example, the ability of employers to ask people to be flexible with the hours that they work and saying that there are much less flexibility, it's hard to see that as anything other than possibly a mild negative on employment. Bringing forward the date at which people have sort of full rights to go to tribunals and such, making it somewhat more difficult to have probationary periods, if that ends up being part of the legislation. Again, might have limited effect on most employers, but there will be some where the effect, if anything, will be somewhat negative. So too early to try and quantify any of that, but probably on balance, the risks are that it's slightly negative for employment.
Thanks, David. This one is a question for you, I think, Tom. Peter Ward asks, what are you forecasting for reductions in tax receipts as a result of the hundreds or thousands of the top 1% of taxpayers who provide around 30% of income tax receipts exiting the UK for other more tax-friendly jurisdictions?
Thanks. So we made some assumptions at the October budget around the impact of the measures that were announced then, in particular on carried interest and on non-domiciles, that those measures would lead to an increase in high net worth individuals leaving the country, roughly in the sort of low thousands. We've not updated that assumption at this event, and we haven't seen any sort of strong evidence since October that would have led us to do that. The government has made one change to the non-dom reforms, but we judged that would not have a material impact on those judgments. I mean, more broadly, talking about the kind of uncertainties and risks around the forecast, all of our fiscal forecasts are based on the assumption that the tax to GDP ratio rises over the forecast period to what would be a historic high, around 5 percentage points higher than it was at the pandemic, around 2 percentage points higher than it is now. That's largely driven by policy decisions that the current government took at the last budget, but also that the previous government took when they froze personal tax thresholds. But that is another area of significant kind of risk and uncertainty around the forecast as to whether those policies will deliver the tax that we expect. Obviously, all the uncertainties that we talked about in terms of the economy are very relevant in terms of tax take as well.
Thank you very much, Tom. Richard, I'm going to come to you. Just a couple more questions on tariffs. Someone asked for clarification of whether our forecasts include any tariffs or not. And David Maddox from The Independent asks, how precarious are your forecasts given the possibility of Trump imposing tariffs next week? And even if he doesn't, the requirement for the government to meet its house building targets, So a couple of uncertainties there. Do you anticipate being forced to make major changes? So mostly tariffs with a little bit of house building too.
So our central forecast is based on the IMF's January World Economic Outlook for the global economy, which was also the practice followed by the Bank of England in their recent forecasts, which didn't include any impact from the new US tariffs on the global economy and therefore on our global forecast. As you saw in the presentation, the impact of the additional tariffs that have been imposed so far on Mexico, Canada and China are relatively limited for the UK in the medium term. But scenarios where the US imposes much more significant tariffs on the rest of the world, on Europe, on the UK, do have material impacts on our growth forecast up to 1% in next year at the peak, and can have quite big fiscal effects. So I would say our forecast is very sensitive to what US tariff policy turns out to be, which we will find out more about in the coming days. I would say it's less sensitive to what happens on the housing side, partly because house building, it only really ramps up additional house building only really ramps up towards the end of the forecast. Even at the end, it's only adding about 0.2 to potential output by the 5th year of the forecast, and it's generating the better part of £3 billion worth of extra revenue by the end of the forecast. So not hugely sensitive to housing, but significantly sensitive to what happens in global trading arrangements.
Thanks, Richard. This one is, I think, for you, David, from Philip Inman at The Guardian. The Chancellor said public investment would crowd in private investment, but the OBR believes it will crowd out the private sector. Can you explain why when you say that slack and the output gap has increased?
Well, it looks like because we had relatively low growth last year, particularly in the second half of the year, and that seems to continue at least into the early part of this year, and we think it's going to be another low growth year. I mean, that is opening up a bit of slack in the economy that we think. And you sort of see signs of it in the labour market with vacancies have come down really quite sharply recently, and firms' hiring intentions seem to have slackened off. So that's pretty clear evidence, I think, that there is opening up a bit of slack in the UK economy. On the question about investment and crowding in and crowding out, it depends what kind of investment one's talking about. Public sector investment now, one is talking about. If you get a lot more investment on transport, on building new roads to areas of the country, that's likely to have positive knock-on effects on private sector investment. Housing probably doesn't have that same sort of effect, and that's the main increase in investments taking place. Although I should say, of course, that the extra house building that we think is coming is not government building houses itself. It is allowing more houses to be built by the private sector. So that's kind of directly increasing private sector investment because that's what it is. What was the third part of the question? Oh, maybe there wasn't a third part of the question.
No, I think you've done a decent job on the main bits.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you to say.
Oh, it's my pleasure. We've got loads, so we'll rattle through a few more. A question on our asset purchase facility assumptions. Louis Ashworth from FT Alphaville asks, why are you still forecasting active sales of gilts from the asset purchase facility based on only figures for the first 2 years of quantitative tightening? You able to take that one, Tom?
Thanks. So in terms of that assumption, it's obviously the Monetary Policy Committee that take decisions on the pace of QT, APF unwinds. They set out a plan just for the year ahead. So we obviously take that plan for the year ahead. And then we make an assumption for the following years, which is based on what the MPC has done in the past and statements they've said about the overriding principles that will guide their decisions in the future, which we think is a reasonable methodology. I mean, it is an area like everything else in the forecast that we kind of review and look at each time. I think one thing to be clear on is the impact that this has on the Chancellor's chances of meeting her fiscal targets, which has changed over the last year or so, given the Chancellor's new fiscal rules and the fact that the current budget deficit is now the binding constraint. And therefore, the element of APF losses that feed into the current budget is the interest losses only, rather than the losses that are made on sales of gilts. So it is the case now that a faster pace of APF unwind will actually reduce the impact of the APF on the current budget. So a faster rate of APF unwind would actually make it easier for the Chancellor to hit her target rather than more difficult.
Thank you. Do we have anyone in the room? Okay, good. We'll take these two and then a final couple from Slido starting here.
Just back to tariffs. So in the scenario where everyone is retaliating, and the UK does retaliate, the UK manages to get some fiscal claws back, some revenues, but it doesn't necessarily seem to make the growth or the inflation impact worse, which would suggest that a UK retaliating in a world where everyone is retaliating is actually, could be fiscally a little bit more beneficial and not have that much side effects. Am I making the correct assumption? And then just on a couple of things, defence spending. You've sort of forecasted a 3% scenario, how much it would in terms of borrowing. What would the growth impact of that be? Could it be enough to offset some of the other fiscal consolidation in other parts? And then just finally on the government's promise to deregulate, it doesn't really feature much in the EFO. Is that because you just don't know what deregulation looks like, that you just aren't able to put any sort of numbers on it? Or is that because deregulation in and of itself is not going to be materially impactful for the public finances?
Excellent. Another great trio. Richard, why don't you have a go at all three? We've got tariffs and retaliation, growth impacts of defence spending, and what we think about deregulation.
So on tariffs, in a nutshell, the revenue benefits that you might get from retaliating are offset by the hit that you get from being caught up in the trade war. And also, by putting tariffs on imports, you are, as David was pointing out, raising your price level, putting up inflation. The government has got lots of inflation-linked expenditure, including the triple lock on pensions, including index-linked debt. And so inflation can be costly for governments as well as the impact that it has on the real economy. So for government, there are as many negative fiscal effects as there are positive ones from engaging in a trade war. On defence, getting to 3% from the 2.5%, which is where the government has now paid to get itself by 2027, costs around an extra £17 billion a year in 2030 money, although we're not quite sure when that ambition is going to be achieved. We would look at what the government's defence investment plans were once those more clearly set out. I guess it's important to point out that the government hasn't actually done a spending review yet, right? So we're not quite sure how they're going to fit this ambition in alongside all the other ambitions they have for health, education, transport, etc. over the next 5 years. We will look at that in the round against our potential output framework. A lot depends actually on whether this is investment in buying equipment from abroad or buying equipment domestically and as an investment in the UK's domestic production base. As well as other considerations. So it's something which we would have to look at in the round. And then just on kind of wider deregulatory ambitions, we tend to not, until they're clearly specified as a set of policies that we can actually look at, take much note of those kind of ambitions in our forecast. Where like the defence ambition, there's a clear number but not a deadline, we can put a sort of number on it. I think just saying we're going to vaguely deregulate the economy is kind of hard to make sense of from our perspective.
Thanks, Richard. And here at the front.
Thank you. I was hoping to ask a little bit more about welfare. So initially, when the government made a series of announcements on welfare reforms, they claimed it would yield savings of £5 billion. And it looks like from the documents today that the actual savings from those initial announcements was £3.4 billion, and so they've had to do a bit more. And can I ask why did those reforms not yield as much as the government thought? And then I was just hoping to ask as well on net migration. I can see the figures have been revised up in terms of where the numbers will settle in the medium term. And you mentioned that they'll probably be revised higher again. What's the impact of that in terms of growth and other factors that you look at?
Great. I think we can hear from all of the panel on bits of that. So, Richard, can you start a little bit on the process around welfare? Tom, maybe a little on the welfare numbers, and then David on net migration.
Yeah, so just on the process on welfare, I mean, one thing to say is that this is very much a preliminary view from us on the overall impact of the welfare package. We got the overall package very late in the process after agreed deadlines were missed. We didn't get all of the detailed evaluation that we usually have alongside those measures in this forecast. And also, a number of the elements of the package are not particularly well specified. For example, there is in that a government commitment to introducing an employment support program, but that is pretty much all it says. We don't know how many people it's going to be operating upon, how it's going to be rolled out, what kind of support it's going to provide. So, we will take a further look at this once the details of the whole green paper are clearer. In terms of what, how our £5 billion compares to sort of other numbers in the government's own publications, maybe Tom can say a bit more.
Yeah, well, so the £5 billion worth of savings to welfare is the number that we have assessed and estimated in our publications. The 3.4 billion that I think you mentioned is the number that you get if you subtract from that the cost of DWP departmental spending to fund the employment support program that Richard mentioned, and also some additional money to fund fraud and error and some other programs, which add up to 1.4 billion. So the 3.4 is essentially 4.8 of AMI savings minus 1.4 of DWP departmental spending. And both those numbers are consistent with the ones we have.
And a view on net migration, David?
Yes, you're absolutely right, of course. The number that we project coming down from the current recently very high levels of net migration toward, we thought that was going to be 315,000 a year, if I remember correctly. It's now something like 340, so it's about £25,000, 25,000 people, I should say, more. That's still a steep fall, and that looks almost inevitable given what's happening to visas, but it falls to a slightly higher level. So the question, what does it mean to have a slightly higher level, 25,000 a year more? Well, depends what kind of people. That's a weak answer, but it's true. Most of them are probably going to work. Therefore, in terms of aggregate GDP, almost certainly positive. In many ways, that's not the thing that matters for quality of life, because GDP per capita is the relevant number there. And there it's less obvious. It will depend on what people do, what salaries, earnings they get, what output they generate. Probably true that in the short run, to have more people coming into the country gets you a short-run fiscal benefit, even if their pay is relatively low. But if their pay is relatively low, beneath average pay in the people who work in the UK by some margin, then further down the road, it becomes fiscally neutral and may even turn to fiscally negative. So it depends very much on, well, who's coming.
Great. We'll finish up with a few questions from Slido. Tom, we've got some questions about the latest public finances data that was published on Friday, I think. One question, did you include the public finances data for February in this forecast? And another saying, considering the miss in the public finances data in February, how are you thinking about risks to your cash requirement forecast for the next fiscal year?
So quickly, we incorporated all of the information from the January ONS release, and quite a large proportion of the information from the February release, but not the full release itself. And therefore, most of the news in there was incorporated in our forecast. I mean, it's always also important to say that there's always a lot of month-to-month movement in those numbers. A lot of revisions take place after the initial month, and a lot of volatility, in particular in public spending and local authority components of those releases. So it's wise not to put too much weight on any individual month.
Thank you. Richard, a question on departmental spending. The OBR stated unprotected departments' spending will need to be reduced by 0.8% in real terms by 2027-28, but the Chancellor said that spending across all departments will rise every year in real terms. How do both statements hold?
So both the statements true. The Chancellor's statement was about the overall growth in the spending envelope, which does grow by about 1.2% beyond next financial year, so over the next spending review period, over which they're now concluding the spending review process. So overall spending is growing by about 1.2. Within that, if you take a sort of reasonable view of what, based on historical precedent, health has got, you meet the defence commitment, you meet pressures in schools and elsewhere, what that leaves for the so-called unprotected departments would be, based on our estimates, real cuts in their budgets year on year of around 0.8. So the Chancellor's statement was about the overall envelope for spending, but within that, once you take account of pressures on some pretty big ticket items like the NHS, that does leave real cuts for some other departments. I should say that 0.8 is less than what the real squeeze was in our last forecast, and that's partly because there's been this swap between current spending for ODA in terms of into capital spending for defence. So that's freed up a bit of pressure on current budgets, which is what most of the unprotected departments spend. It's also significantly less than we saw in our forecast this time last year, but it's nonetheless real terms reductions in that group.
And because that was succinct, I'm afraid, get another question. A bonus question from Bertie, who says, you have assumed fuel duty, a fuel duty increase will be actioned again, versus the political choice of not increasing. You say it's 3.8 billion of revenue, which eats again into the headroom by about a third. Why do you keep doing this?
We do it because that's what the law says we have to do, which is take stated government policy and put it into our forecast. After complaints by the Treasury Select Committee about this charade, they've also asked us to put in an alternative scenario which shows what governments have actually done year on year since 2011, which is to freeze fuel duty or indeed cut it in some events. And so we also produce a version of our forecast, including our assessment of performance against the fiscal rules, which includes that freeze on fuel duty, which would be more in line with what governments have actually done over the last 15 years, rather than what governments have promised they would do over the last 15 years. Even in that scenario, the Chancellor's still got some headroom left because she's left herself £10 billion, but it is a significant knock to that.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions on real household disposable income, David. There's a big upgrade to our HDI in 2024. Is that where the growth comes from? John Paul Ford Rojas asks, the Chancellor boasts of higher living standards, but they only go up after the tax threshold freeze ends. How likely is that to happen? And does that mean an RHDI recovery is less certain? Philip Inman at The Guardian asks, there is a significant increase in per capita incomes next year. Can you explain what lies behind that? So I think that's a few questions in and around per capita GDP and RHDI.
Okay, quickly. The main boost to real household disposable income in the short run, it comes from the fact that wage settlements are running quite a long way ahead of inflation at the moment. I mean, we think that's going to slow down. It's somewhat transitory, but while it lasts, it's the main driver of higher real household disposable income, because not surprisingly, for most households, nearly all of their income comes from employment, and wage settlements have been running at 5-6% or so, and inflation's now dipped under 3%. Further down the road, we think wage settlement is going to come down to barely exceed the rate of inflation, and that slows down the rate of growth of real household disposable income. Over the 5 years as a whole of our forecast period, there's some growth in real household disposable income, but frankly, it's at a pretty low rate relative to the longer run history of the UK. I mean, it's something like 0.5% a year. Again, I'm making the past sound like a wonderful place, but in the old days, one got used to productivity being around about 2% real a year, and so people's real income was going up. Most people's real income was going up by about 2% a year. So 0.5% a year for 5 years would be a really period of very low growth in real household disposable income.
Great. My watch hasn't ticked over yet, so Richard, a final question for you. It's a good one to end on. In a £2.5 trillion economy, why is headroom of £9 billion so low? Any project manager would have a risk pot of around 5 to 10%. You've listed many risks. Are we going to see them scored in future?
So what we always do around our central forecast is show where the risks lie. We try and take a central path through that risky world, but I think it's fair to say that the UK has experienced a lot of shocks over the recent past, and the bigger the shocks have got, the lower the headroom that chancellors have left themselves, which is clearly something which goes against one's expectations. I think one of the challenges chancellors have faced in trying to rebuild headroom in the current environment is the fact that we have a very high stock of debt and interest rates have been rising as these shocks have hit the UK economy. And that just means that the first claim on public resources is always servicing the debt. And that has become more and more expensive over time. And that's eaten into the fiscal space that chancellors otherwise have to make difficult fiscal choices. And you probably saw in that chart that I showed earlier that there was suddenly a step down in the level of headroom that chancellors retained against their fiscal rules around the sort of early 2020s. And that was the point when interest rates really started going up from less than 1% up to where they are now around between 4.5% and 5%. And that has really eaten into the sort of spare resources available to chancellors. And an awful lot of the difficult fiscal decisions they've had to make in the recent past has been in response to the fact that servicing the very large stock of debt that we now have as a country has become a lot more expensive, and they've got to find some resources to enable them to do that. That's one of the reasons why taxes have gone up, and it's one of the reasons why they're having to make these reductions in spending.
Thank you. That definitely is all we've got time for. So apologies, as always, to those whose questions we didn't get to. Do follow up with us if you'd like answers or further information. And I'll just finish by saying thanks to everybody for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event following the publication of our Fiscal Risks and Sustainability Report in the summer.